Hey, hello again, everybody. Welcome back. So this is our next installment of our asynchronous class. And hopefully, as you can tell, I have changed computers. So I apologize. I was reviewing the last video on our Zuboff quotations, and I was using my monitor. So I did not realize that my monitor or my camera on my monitor was crap. So yeah, I apologize for the documents being blurry. So this should be much better. So fingers crossed that that is the case. So let's try it out. Pull up my screen here. All right, hopefully this is much clearer. So last video, we went over the group work on the quotations from Zuboff. So now we're going to take a look at the essay one brainstorming. And so the questions here were taken from our thought provoker questions from the prompt, which I'll pull up here. And just as a quick refresher, our prompt questions for essay one. So how was the right to the future tense of young Black women in early 20th century Harlem placed under systematic threat? How might Zuboff describe the threats of or the kinds of resistance that young women like Esther Brown developed in response to this threat? Okay, so whenever we get a new prompt, we want to spend a little time kind of unpacking it, right? So thinking about what are the key terms and concepts from the prompt questions. And once we figure that out, then we know the key terms that we will need to define and to apply to help us form connections between the texts. And so for us, right, the right to the future tense, which comes from Zuboff, also systematic threat, which comes from Zuboff. So we're taking those concepts from Zuboff and we're applying them to Hartman's text to help us interpret the kind of threat to the right to the future tense that young Black women like Esther Brown in early 20th century Harlem experienced, and also how they resisted those forms of threat. And particularly the second question, right, is we want to think about how Zuboff would describe the kinds of resistance these young women developed in response to the threat. So one of the thought-provoker questions, right, is asking what key terms Zuboff uses to describe resistance. And so we'll take a look at that as well. Okay, and so for the first question, right, we were looking for quotations from Zuboff that help to define the right to the future tense. And we scroll down, we have strong responses here, and you did a good job bringing in quotations from Arendt to help you kind of unpack and interpret the quotations from Zuboff to help you define the right to the future tense. What I want to call our attention to is that usually when we are first defining a key term, we're going to want to bring in a quotation with that key term in it explicitly. And then if you want to bring in other quotations or parts of other quotations to supplement that key term to help you more fully develop its definition, give you more language to play around with and to connect to the other text, you can do that as well. So if we take a look here, I'm going to, if I can move this out of the way. Just a second here. Okay. So one quick and easy way to find quotations with the key terms in them is just to search the PDF of the chapter, right? So here, I think I'll have to pull this up on my end, just one moment here. Okay, so one way to do that is to search the document, right? So here I have Zuboff's chapter up. And if we search the document, which on a Mac anyway is Command F, I type in, I don't think it's going to let me do it actually while I'm recording, but you would type in right to the future tense. On a second here. Oh, let me do it. So you'll see it pulls up 14 instances of this key term. And there are so many, right? Because Zuboff uses that key term in her chapter title, which then also appears at the top of all of these pages, right? So if we move through, we'll find an actual quotation. So here from the text on page 332, so she uses it there. And also on that same page further down, so those are two quotations we could choose from. Keep looking. And also on 337, so there's the third quotation we could take a look at. And there's one more. So on 347, then we have a fourth quotation. Okay, so I've made a Google Doc that pulls or puts all of those quotations together so we can take a look at them. And here they are, our four quotations. And so what we want to think about then are the key terms and key ideas that Zuboff uses as she's defining the right to the future tense. So go ahead and take a moment in our play pause it bulb here and read through our quotations and type in what the key terms are that help Zuboff define the right to the future tense. Okay, let's take a look at the first quotation. So our freedom flourishes only as we steadily will ourselves to close the gap between making promises and keeping them. Implicit in this action is an assertion that through my will, I can influence the future. It does not imply total authority over the future, of course, only over my piece of it. In this way, the assertion of freedom of will also asserts the right to the future tense as a condition of a fully human life. And I want to pause just a moment. So thinking about our rough drafts that will be due next class, when you're cutting and pasting from the PDF of Zuboff's chapter, you're going to need to do some tweaking. So it will tend, once you paste it into your document, it's going to kind of mess up words or be missing words. So you want to make sure you're double checking to make sure that you have the full, incomplete, and correct quotation. Okay, yeah, so with quotation one, so freedom shows up, right? So she associates freedom with the right to the future tense, right? And so that's an expression of freedom. And also this notion of promises, will. So part of freedom, right, is willing ourselves, making promises, and that helps us navigate our future, which is our next key term that pops up there, right? These key terms from Arendt. And it doesn't imply total authority over the future, right? And notice how different that is from the quotations we looked at concerning surveillance capitalism, right? Which were tending to dominate users, right? To assert mastery over them. And in Zuboff's language, right, trying to author the users or to automate them, right? So unlike what surveillance capitalism is trying to do, a user, when they are making promises which come from a will that is free, when they make promises, they gain some control over the future. It's not absolute, right? So some of the future remains uncertain. And so it doesn't imply total authority over the future. this feature again, only over my piece of it. And this way, the assertion of freedom of will, so we're pulling together freedom and will here, also asserts the right to the future tense. Okay, so there's our big key term, as a condition of a fully human life. And so this notion of a fully human life, right, as opposed to a life that is automated or made machine-like. And good, so the right to the future tense, right, is necessarily free, right, where the will is free to make promises. And so certainly we can imagine in body paragraph 1, when you first set out to define the right to the future tense, you could bring in this quotation, for example, and, unpack it, define it, or make connections to Arendt, right? You could bring in little quotations from Arendt. Good. And so now let's shift over to quotation 2. So kind of revising here a little bit. So go ahead and take a moment, read through quotation 2 and type into the bulb the key terms and important language that pop out that are helping Zuboff define the right to the future tense. Okay, let's take a look at quotation 2. So I suggest that we now face the moment in history when the elemental right to the future tense is endangered by a pan-invasive digital architecture of behavioral modification owned and operated by surveillance capital, necessitated by its economic imperatives and driven by its laws of motion, all for the sake of its guaranteed outcomes. Okay, so again, this could be a good quotation to first introduce and define the right to the future tense, because again, that key term shows up in that quotation explicitly. Okay, and this is a good quotation too to help introduce threat that surveillance capitalism poses to the right to the future tense, right? And that can help us with essay 1 when we want to explore how young women like Esther Brown's right to the future tense was under threat at that historical moment at the beginning of the 20th century. And so here, so we now face the moment in history when the elemental right to the future tense is endangered by a pan-invasive, right? So kind of all-consuming digital architecture of behavior modification. So I would kind of pluck out behavior modification here as a useful key term, owned and operated by surveillance capital, necessitated by its economic imperatives, right? So we get this idea that this kind of control of behavior, this modification of behavior, again, is motivated by economic interests, by profit, and driven by its law of motion, all for the sake of its guaranteed outcomes. So again, we saw that key term pop up in a quotation from our last video from that group work. All right, and so again, we get some different key terms we could use here. So these were all kind of Arendt's key terms. And here we have behavior modification, guaranteed outcomes, which are Zuboff's key terms, which we could, of course, unpack and define using some of these key terms from Arendt. And so what's happening here, notice we have 4 options. And, as I kind of broke down in the prompt sheet itself, when you build your body paragraphs, you want at least 1 quotation from Hartman and 1 from Zuboff. And as you're thinking about the threat that these women, right, are experiencing in terms of their right to the future tense, you're going to want to pair a quotation from Hartman demonstrating that threat with a quotation from Zuboff that talks about the threat, right, of surveillance capitalism. And so if we had a passage from Hartman where, authorities, for example, are trying to modify the behavior of young women like Esther Brown, They're imagining their future as a guaranteed outcome, right? So basically you would want to pair that passage from Hartman with this quotation from Zuboff, right? So you want to think about, okay, when I'm making connections between quotations from both texts, what language and key terms are going to pair most directly. And so you're going to be selective about the quotations you pick to define your key terms. All right, so go ahead and take a look at quotation 3 and pull out the key terms and important language that she's using to define the right to the future tense. Okay, let's take a look. So quotation 3, uncertainty is not chaos, but rather the necessary habitat of the present tense. We choose the fallibility of shared promises, right? Promises that aren't guaranteed, right? That might not be fulfilled because the future and the present are uncertain. But we choose that fallibility and problem solving over the certain tyranny imposed by dominant power or plan, because this is the price we pay for the freedom to will, which founds our right to the future tense. In the absence of this freedom, the future collapses into an infinite present of mere behavior, in which there can be no subjects and no projects, only objects. Okay, so I am sure everyone pulled out uncertainty, right? That important key term from Arendt. So Zuboff is drawing from that. And so saying uncertainty is not chaos, right? So it might be uncomfortable, it might provoke fear, but we need it, right? It's the necessary habitat of the present tense. So again, this idea of promises and problem solving, right, which is necessarily human. We see that in the example of the old couple, right, with the guy who's coming over to possess their car or repossess it. And notice, right, the opposite of uncertainty, certain tyranny. So in other words, our options here are uncertain freedom and certain tyranny, right, imposed by dominant power. I pull out dominant power that could be useful in making a connection to Hartman. This is the price we pay. So there's a trade-off here for the freedom to will. And notice which founds our right to the future tense. And so here, right, she gives us a pretty clear-cut definition of the right to the future tense. So basically, the right to the future tense depends on having the freedom to will, right? So if we don't have the freedom to will, then we cannot assert a right to the future tense, right? We kind of lose our future and our ability to shape that future. So in the absence of this freedom, the future collapses, right? So if you don't have a free will, the freedom to will, the future collapses into an infinite present, right? So implying that, okay, well, we no longer have a future as such, right? The future becomes an infinite present, right, of mere behavior, right? So mere behavior as opposed to, for example, behavior or action that's original, right? So here it's unoriginal action, it's mere behavior in which there can be no subjects. And so subjects meaning, a person who has a sense of agency or control over their future, right? Who has the freedom to will and to act on that will. And no projects. So when we were doing our oppositions, right, there's this opposition between projects and objects. And so as you guys pointed out, projects relates to the future, right? So your ability to kind of shape projects and plans for the future, and objects are then associated with the past, right? They're certain. And so here, we can't shape projects anymore, right? So we're kind of stuck in the present. We no longer have access to the future. Okay, and so making connections to Hartman, this quotation is helpful not only to help define the right to the future tense, right, bringing in the freedom of will, for example, but also the threat to the right to the future tense. So just as we saw with quotation 2, right, when we had this notion of endangerment. So here, right, when we start bringing in certain tyranny and a dominant power, right, so here we can start imagining how the right to the future tense would be threatened. And threatened in particular by collapsing the future into the present tense of mere behavior, right? So we could play around with that. The threat to the right to the future tense, and see if we have a moment in Hartman where the authorities, those in control, social workers, police officers, judges, are they attempting to collapse young women like Esther Brown's future into an infinite present, where they're not active subjects, they become objects, right? Okay, and they're asserting a sense of dominance, right? Then they become a dominant power. Okay, and our last one, so quotation 4. So again, go ahead and take a look at that. Pull out words and phrases that seem important for defining the right to the future tense. And also what language might be helpful to set up what kind of threats could appear to the right to the future tense. Okay, so quotation 4, social participation and individual effectiveness should not require the sacrifice of our right to the future tense. So again, that key term shows up in the quotation. So our right to the future tense, which comprises our will to will, our autonomy, our decision rights, our privacy, and indeed our human natures. Okay, good. And so for our purposes, the beginning of the quotation might not be particularly helpful, but here she's giving us an explicit definition of the right to the future tense, right? So the right to the future tense, which is made up of, right, our will to will, our autonomy, our decision rights, right, our right to make our own decisions, to shape our futures, to make promises, our privacy, and indeed our human natures. So again, we can see how this could all translate to when we want to talk about how the right to the future tense could come under threat. So in other words, in passages in Hartman, do we see moments where these young women's will to will, their autonomy, their decision rights, right? In other words, their right to make their own decisions, original decisions, to act originally. Do we see their privacy and even their human natures being threatened? And so if you would find a passage that illustrates that, then you would want to pair it up with this particular quotation, right, to make that nice direct connection. All right, so what we'll do is next video, we will take a passage from Hartman and we'll practice interpreting it in light of Zuboff's The Right to the Future Tense, right? So again, kind of thinking of strategies for pairing quotations from the different texts, and that can be the basis of building a body paragraph for essay 1. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.